Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini episode 1832. This is FDH managing partner Rick Morris coming at you today. And we have with us here, this is going to be a really great segment. A new member of our family here with the FDH Lounge, a new dignitary in the lounge, Chris Evans, a gentleman who, like myself, has the great honor and distinction of being a grad from the vaunted Scripps School of Communications down at Ohio University. And there's far more than that binds us, actually. He is somebody who got to be a friend via his father, the late, great James Evans, who I was pretty tight with back in the day playing fantasy baseball, being on a bowling team with him. I know Chris has heard the story about how him and another guy on our team saved a man's life the one night, jumping in and delivering CPR to a guy that had a heart attack. I was sitting there keeping score. It happened right in front of me. I kind of panicked and jumped back because I kind of knew I would be of no use, and I figured somebody else would be of use. And one of the people that it was James, and saved the man's life, and just the kind of guy that he always was. And Chris certainly shows, in terms of his personal character, the apple does not fall far from the tree. And I was able to catch with great interest here when Chris had sent my way recently. It was a podcast that he did upon graduation from the Scripps School. I guess sort of in lieu of a term paper. I guess that they were not doing that when I went there. There was no such thing as a podcast, but it covered a lot of different topics. I learned a great deal about that I didn't know about the history of Chavez Ravine. I knew there was a hidden underbelly there, but learned a lot more about it from Chris. And he kind of teased in there that he didn't have room in the course of this podcast, but would like to get to subsequently the story of Moneyball and some of his particular thoughts on it. So I kind of hearkened back to the 19th mini episode of the FDH Lounge, mere months after we split away from the late lamented Sports Talk Network. This was in October of 2011, mini episode 19. It was a reunion of the show that first put me on the path to doing this show. It was a reunion of Reality Check from the Sports Talk Network, a show that Ron Glassnapp, the late, great Dave Adams, and I did from 2003 to 2005. And it was a great opportunity after we'd gone to see Moneyball to come back and just kind of feel like old times sitting there discussing it. So I suggested to Chris, I said, why don't you go back and review what we talked about? I will do the same. And we'll talk about our thoughts on Moneyball, the movie, the book. And Chris also has some thoughts that I think are going to be very good to bring this thing full circle and talk about how it ties into today's game and a game beyond baseball. Here's a little bit of a teaser there. There's another sport that was not mentioned in Moneyball altogether that one of the sort of main characters is factoring into today. But with all that being said, it is my great honor and pleasure to have on the FDH Lounge Chris Evans. Chris, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Man, I got a whole 3-minute intro for myself. Actually, real quick, just to clear up any confusion, my father and my grandfather are actually the reason why I'm known professionally as J. William, because that's their first initial and middle name. So it's a way to kind of tie that in. I don't, if you recall, with the podcast, I made a little CD booklet to accompany that. And then in the back, I credited myself all the things that I did, because I did the whole thing myself, as Christopher J. William Evans. So just to put a little artist touch on the work, as opposed to just crediting myself as my first and last name, because it seems kind of bland. It would feel like a missed opportunity if I didn't any. And plus, if your first and last name is Chris Evans, that kind of creates expectations in the minds of some people that sometimes it's easier to lean into, and sometimes you want to try to distinguish yourself from that. So. That's actually one of the reasons why I'm wearing the Blue Jacket sweater right now. It's a not so subtle nod to that, because I don't have a Captain America t-shirt. It's probably the closest thing I have to it, but it does also tie into what some of my personal interests are too. But real quick, before we go any further, I do have to ask, can I cuss on here?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, we do not have any restrictions on that. I will say also too, the dilemma that you have with your name, shared by, I think in some ways, one of the actors in the Moneyball movie, Chris Pratt here, who himself now is known for bigger things other than being Scott Hatterberg. So there are different people that have to carry these hero mantles around with them here. You know, Chris Pratt is another individual like that subsequently.
Yeah, the and the Moneyball thing, going back to what you talked about earlier, you're right. I did allude to that on the podcast. I kind of stuck it in the middle there. That
Hmm.
I had some thoughts on Moneyball, but I didn't get time to share them. And the reason for that is because my director and I had agreed upon beforehand, like what's a good time limit for this sort of thing, and we went
Hmm.
back and forth on a couple different ideas. And I said, you know what, let's just make it an even hour. So the main podcast ends at like 1 hour and 0 seconds. I made sure of that. But nowhere in there does the Moneyball thing fit in. That was just going to be an extra thing that I did uh, just for my own creative satisfaction. But as I was drafting the script, because I started drafting this whole thing back in like, early mid-December,
Hmm.
and that was part of it. And as I started going back to it, as I revisited it and kind of changed some of the language around and maybe changed some of my thoughts to reflect what I was really feeling at the time, I realized, man, this is like a half an hour long conversation unto itself. And I'm already kind of sick of editing and mixing this thing with all the
Yeah.
music that I put into it and everything. Plus, it goes way beyond the expected time limit. And why make this thing only to tell my program director, Brittany Peterson, hey, you don't have to listen to this part of it. It's not part of the thing, but
Hmm.
if you got time, if you want to, it's like, nah, let's not even bother. Let's save it for a later date. And I guess this is that later date. And I can think of
Yeah.
no better way to do it because this is I like this format. I don't really get the chance to actually have conversations like this for the
Hmm.
purpose of recording a podcast or doing a live show. It's always been
Yeah.
something that I've kind of done on my own time. So I like that it's a change of pace, and I think a lot of the thoughts and the feelings probably come out a little bit more clearly this way too.
Yeah, I think it's going to work out very well. And so, what I want to do is just start by giving a brief kind of summation from as I went back and I re listened to the mini episode 19 from October of 2011. Some of the thoughts that Ron and Dave and I had at the time. And I will just say that, and again, that it brings a lot of feelings to listen to that. I mean, not me. It already would be there in terms of the nostalgia from the old reality check days, but it's a little starker that unfortunately Dave Adams stepped off this spinning ball of hot lava that we call Earth back in December of 22, and that remains kind of a poignant thing for a lot of us to this day. So just hearing his voice again, I mean, it feels great. It feels great to be there in the room. I go all the way back with him, like back in the day, back to the 80s. So it's great to get to hear his voice. It's great to get to kind of live in that moment a little bit. And we talked about some things that I have seen subsequently are observations that, frankly, a lot of other people I think made as well here. That some of the biggest stars on the A's did not get mentioned in the movie. They weren't touched on in the book that much either because it kind of got in the way of the narrative here. So Chavez, Tejada, and the great pitchers Hudson, Mulder, Zito. You don't really hear about them in there. Thing with Scott Hatterberg, he talked about this subsequently that Art Howe was not really an antagonist to him. He wasn't at all. He said Art Howe was personally supportive of him, but just he preferred that he spend a lot more time at DH until he could get defensively sufficient at first base, which, as Scott Hatterberg said, really made a lot of sense. And of course, the way that he was played, Art Howe was played in the movie by the late great Philip Seymour Hoffman. That's a thing where I think we chuckled about that on the podcast at the time, that Art Howe couldn't have been happy about that, and indeed he wasn't, as far as how he was portrayed in the movie, and that there were just a couple of other things here as far as how the movie went. I think we noted also that it made for a really kind of imperfect kind of a thing here. That you get that Hollywood wants to do a sports movie and they want to do something about a book that I think, again, I think it's the most influential sports book of the 21st century because of the analytics revolution that has happened now across all sports. Although I do think that, by the 2020s, the AI thing would have kicked it into that. Had we not gone into analytics by the 2020s, it would have happened by now anyways, probably. But when you look, and I think one of the most influential books in the history of sports, because even the other big ones like Ball 4, Paper Lion, those were huge, but they didn't really influence what happened there. The Bill James books in the 80s maybe serving as a bit of a precursor, you could maybe say, were pretty influential here as well. But that was a thing where, again, the movie was definitely Hollywoodized. I think we noted at the time in the podcast that, in fairness, this is one where it doesn't really fit into that neat little bundle that Hollywood loves, because it was a thing where this team kept coming up short in the postseason. They could make it as far as the postseason. They never got over the top. And it's one of those things where, to the casual audience out there, I guess maybe you could spin it as, they reached a higher plateau than maybe they did before they started the Moneyball stuff, which seems to be pegged to about the 02 season or so. Although, outside of the 20-game winning streak, what tangibly really kind of came out of it? I mean, they just kept getting eliminated in the postseason. So these were a number of points that we made, I think, as we were watching the movie. And these were things that kind of jumped out. And I found myself, as I was listening back to it, kind of nodding my head along with a lot of the points we made, because a lot of them, I think, made sense to me then, made sense to me now, as far as the Hollywoodization of it, and as far as the way that the subject material was treated. But Chris, I know you had some thoughts on listening to the podcast, and I know they definitely tie into what your own thoughts were on the book and on the movie, and some of the thoughts that you had coming into listening to us.
Yeah, I think it was Dave, going back to the podcast, who made the comment that Moneyball is very niche in the sense that it's a baseball film. So, if you're going to be casting Brad Pitt and you're going to be casting a fat Jonah Hill and all these different people who are pretty prominent, I think, in Hollywood, at least in the time, and certainly even now, especially in the case of Brad Pitt, it's got to be something that brings people into the theater. It's got to be a box office draw. Doesn't necessarily have to be faithful in a lot of ways. I think maybe being true faithful to the story might even repel some audiences, because then you start to get deeper into the weeds of what's going on. May not necessarily create the best mental and emotional framework for people to play with. And I'll give Moneyball credit where credit is due, just for the sake of objectivity. I will. Excellent screenplay. I think it's paced out very well. The cinematography is great. Even the music. I actually I use some of the music from Moneyball in my podcast when I mix it in with intent, because the music in the film is great. But you're right. Some of the characters, most of the characters are not exactly portrayed the way that you would come to know them in life if you came to know them at all. And Art Howe is only one of them. I'm sure David Justice probably wouldn't appreciate the way that he was portrayed in the film, being a clubhouse cancer. I'm sure Jeremy Giambi wouldn't have appreciated being portrayed by some 5'6" guy with a horrible goatee who's clearly out of shape. So there were certainly some creative liberties that were taken with the story. Now, for the sake of making it the best emotional piece that it could be, which at the end of the day is the most important thing, is Moneyball it does make the whole concept of taking an analytical approach to roster construction and just looking at baseball through a different lens more accessible. And I will acknowledge there's I don't know if you spend any time playing out of the park baseball on your PC at all, but the developers are from Germany. They're based out of Germany. Marcus Heinzen, who founded the company, he started watching baseball about 25, maybe 30 years ago. And based on the dialogue that I've had with him and a lot of people in that community, that film in a lot of ways personifies how much more accessible baseball came to be in markets that would be considered non-traditional outside of the larger thrust of what's happening in baseball, in places like the UK, in France, in Germany, and even down in Australia. So I have to give it credit for all of those things. But circling back to what you said before about how, well, when you step back and you kind of take a look at this from 30,000 feet, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because there's a lot of questions that remain unanswered. First of all, with the A's, right, they had that 20-game win streak. That's really why the story is even worth telling. It's not because they won anything in the end. They didn't. They got wiped out in the ALDS. They won 20 games the year after they lost their biggest free agent, Jason Giambi. And that's not to, that's not to make light of it, because Jason Giambi, I think in his last year in Oakland, he had like a 199 OPS plus or something like that.
Yeah.
He was a 9.8 WAR player, like a ridiculous, just had an incredible season. And then he leaves for New York, right? So the story kind of writes itself. But the truth of the matter is, the A's retained 6 of their next 7 highest WAR players in the following season. This is not exactly a rebuild in the making here. It's not a dire situation. They still have Zito, Mulder, and Hudson in the rotation. They still have Tejada at short. They still have Eric Chavez at third. And they even have Corey Lytle in the rotation as well. This is not a bad baseball team, and they're not exactly playing in a tough division either. The other thing, too, is that there's a lot of teams that played in the 90s and into the early 2000s that were underdogs that didn't win anything. The Indians
Right.
went to 2 World Series, lost in both. The Orioles were good during that time. Didn't get to the World Series, couldn't get past the Yankees. The Mariners were awesome at the time, never got to the World Series. It's not exactly an uncommon thing. Everybody was here trying to get up to here to where the Yankees were at.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reality of the situation. Everybody kind of went about it their own way, but the results were the same.
Yeah.
The other thing that has never really made sense to me, or at least nobody has done a great job of answering the question, is that at the end of the day, while this whole period of time is fun and it's kind of fun to think about how you can lose your best player who's like a 10 WAR guy and still win 100 games, it's fun to think about. But what did it get the A's in the end? What did it really mean for the Oakland A's as a franchise? Did it get them their new stadium built in Fremont or San Jose or at Laney College or Howard Terminal? No, it didn't get them any of those things. Did it get them that World Series run eventually? No, they never went there, and they haven't been there in my lifetime. Now they're in Sacramento. they've got a first-class ticket to Vegas, and they've got a 3-year layover in Sacramento playing in a minor league ballpark. So, and again, that's not to say that if you take the A's approach to building your roster, that would happen to you. Obviously, everybody's circumstances are unique, but I think it's important to keep these things in perspective. At the end of the day, it's fun to think about, but it might be, and this is going to sound a little hyperbolic, but I'm certainly not above hyperbole. The whole concept of Moneyball might be the single most overrated thing in baseball. And I think that Paul DePodesta, who in a lot of ways personifies what Moneyball is supposed to be about, and there's other characters like Bill James as well. But I think Paul DePodesta would certainly be on the Mount Rushmore of characters who have just been, whose legacy I think has been a little bit overstated over time.
Very interesting. And I will say, I believe this was a point of mirth that we had when we were doing the review back in October of 2011, that DePodesta, when the casting changed, and it ended up being, as you alluded to before, Fat Jonah Hill that was going to be playing the character, all of a sudden was like, yeah, I'm not so sure it would be good for my future job interests to be being portrayed as a fat nerd on screen here. So it ends up Peter Brand becomes the stand-in character for Paul DePodesta in the movie there. And by the way, again, I thought that the character actually really kind of worked, because I felt like Jonah Hill, the way that he played it, and sort of that understated kind of, almost kind of shy kind of a way as far as having to be prompted for kind of the knowledge on it. I felt like the character worked. By the same point in time, I understood why DePodesta might see that as being limiting to his future career prospects. I will say also, too, because I know we're going to segue into this at some point here in our discussion, that this is a joke that I've made on the show previously, that I used to think to myself, and I used to really hope that Paul DePodesta, based on his track record that he had, boy, it would be great to have him here in Cleveland. And I've made the joke on the show. Anytime I was praying for that, I forgot to stipulate to God, I meant for the baseball team, not for the football team, because apparently my prayer was granted, but not in the way that I wanted. And we're all paying the price for that, I think, Chris.
Well, what's so funny about that is that all you have to do is invent a time machine, because your wish of Paul DePodesta being at 2401 Carnegie Avenue already came true. That was already a thing.
Yeah. I meant back in charge, but you're right. This is where he came from, because that was the origin story. And that was the thing where, I mean, it just, I thought that it would have been, and this is before, I think I was thinking that more so when Shapiro was in charge here, because I always pretty much just loathed him. This is an organization that I have just felt throughout the Dolan ownership, even when things have been going well, the air of self-congratulation and loving the smell of their own farts on various things is something I've just found obnoxious. So I think it was more so in the time of Shapiro being atop the food chain when I used to hope for DePodesta coming back. And I won't say rescuing this organization, because the only thing that would do that is ownership that's willing to spend to actually back up the work of the front office here. But it is just kind of funny that that's something I used to hope for. And, you know, instead he ends up coming in and being part of Jimmy Haslam polluting the football team in town.
Well, we'll certainly get to that.
Yeah.
But, just taking the last part of that first, you know, about trying to achieve some semblance of stability in baseball. Yeah, you need ownership. You need an ownership group that looks at it more than just like a bottom line business. And that's true. But in the overwhelming majority of cases, if you want to be successful in sports long term, you kind of have to overcome bad ownership.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a part of it. It's unrealistic to think that anybody's going to come in, buy your baseball team, and then deficit spend in the first 3, 4, 5 years to get it to where it is that you want to go. And only doing so by dipping into free agency, which is going to produce diminishing returns, I think, a lot quicker than most people want to give credit for. The reality is there are no shortcuts to this game. You have to draft well. You have to sign international free agents. You have to develop players. And there's something very ironic about wishing upon a star that Paul DePodesta would come back and run the Indians after leaving the A's. He went to the Dodgers instead and was not nearly as successful as future general managers and presidents would be.
True.
But the thing that's ironic about that is that, your sentiments of Mark Shapiro echoed. Yeah, I was never a big fan of his when he was here either. And I have nothing personal against the guy. I've met Mark a couple of times. I've heard people talk about him. Sweetest guy in the world. If this ever gets to Blue Jays fans, I know they don't want to hear that. And I know that they're very upset about the Maple Leafs last night, so I'm not going to pile on. I know they hate the guy. But yeah, if you asked, I would say probably about a solid 80% of them would say that he's running the franchise into the ground, him and Ross Atkins. And I can't sit here and say that they're wrong for that. But I don't think if Paul DePodesta came back and ran the Tribe that it would be any different.
No.
The reason for that is because Paul DePodesta once worked for Mark Shapiro. And this is what segues into why I think Paul DePodesta might be the single most overrated figurehead in baseball, at least over the last 25, 30 years. Because the most success that he had pound for pound in his career as a baseball executive, at least in my opinion, it didn't come in Oakland. It didn't come with those teams that had those back-to-back 100-win seasons only to not make a deep playoff run. The most success that he had was in Cleveland with the 90s Indians. Paul DePodesta was a part of an all-star front office. So everybody remembers John Hart. Everybody remembers John Hart as the Indians GM because of all the amazing trades that he made. Getting Sandy Alomar, right? Trading for Kenny Lofton when he was a rookie in Houston. Getting Omar from Seattle in 94 when Jacobs Field opened. He made some amazing trades. He also drafted Jim Thome, Manny Ramirez. He hit on some guys. And then about midway through his tenure, it started to slip through his fingers a little bit, right? Letting Albert Bell leave in free agency and then trading Kenny Lofton out of paranoia that he would also leave, not acquiring the starting pitching that they need to get over the hump, and also some internal strife. And his assistant general manager at the time, which I don't think nearly as many people remember in Cleveland, is a guy by the name of Dan O'Dowd.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan is a guy that I hold in very high regard. I've listened to him on Sean Casey's podcast and on other podcasts as well, talk about his story and his time going from Baltimore to Cleveland and eventually winding up in Denver as the GM of the Rockies. And he is without question one of the most insightful and one of the most charismatic guys I think you could ever listen to, at least among a population of people who have been in that role. And I think for anybody who wants to wind up in a baseball front office one day, listen to Dan O'Dowd speak about his time and all the challenges that he faced, both personally and professionally, to make that happen, because it's incredibly insightful. He talked on Sean Casey's podcast to hear Dan O'Dowd tell the story. And this brings us back to why Moneyball is not exactly a historical piece. It's mostly a work of fiction. To hear him tell the story, and I don't want to misappropriate anything that Dan says, but when he was explaining what happened in 1998, right? At the time, John Hart was the Indians GM, and he's the assistant general manager, and they have this all-star front office of guys working for them. They have Mark Shapiro working as, I think his official title was Director of Amateur Scouting. I think it was something along those lines. And then up underneath them, you had guys like Neil Huntington, Ben Sherrington, Josh Burns, Chris Antonetti, who was a scouting assistant at the time, and of course, Paul DePodesta. So you have all these individuals working together towards a common goal. Every single one of these guys at one point or another went on to run their own franchise.
Yep.
So in the case of Dan, the way that he explains it was that there was a bit of an internal conflict going on in Cleveland at the time. John Hart was putting together a roadmap for his future, which involved him maybe not necessarily stepping away from baseball, but sort of stepping up into a team president role that would be more of a celebratory role than anything else, right? And taking more of a hands-off approach with the team as he gets ready to transition to his life beyond baseball. And Dan O'Dowd was fully on board with his plan, with the understanding that he would be installed as the general manager and that the Indians would start to take on more of his vision for the future. Not that that vision would be wildly different, but still, nobody who gets to that level is going to be like, I'm kind of fine where I'm at. Like, eventually you want to have the opportunity to run your own team.
Sure.
It's just unrealistic to think not. And at some point over the course of the 1998 season, John Hart had a change of heart, which that's his prerogative, by the way. We all reserve the right to change our mind when it comes to anything, right? So John, Dan O'Dowd, Dick Jacobs, all these any other stakeholders that are involved, they have discussions about, okay, well, what's the long-term plan here, right? Because Dan is doing the same thing that any one of us would do if we were caught in that situation. We take inventory of what's happening and we decide whether we're going to fit in or whether we're going to fit out. And so Dan's perspective is, well, I don't know that I agreed with your plan with the understanding that you were going to change your mind and that I was going to be tethered to this assistant general manager's role forever. I'd like to explore opportunities, right? So this internal conflict led to, we can call it a little bit of political unrest, I guess, if you want to call it, at the corner of Carnegie and Ontario. So Dan O'Dowd leaves the franchise after the 1998 season, and he takes a year off, eventually becomes the Rockies GM. So because Dan O'Dowd is no longer in the fold, now we have to have an heir apparent to John Hart. And that guy becomes Mark Shapiro. He is pegged as the guy who, once John Hart retires, or as what happened in real life, leaves to go to the Rangers after losing Manny Ramirez in free agency in 2000, Mark Shapiro is going to take over the club for him, and that Chris Antonetti is going to be his right-hand man. So all these other individuals who are involved, Sherrington, Huntington, Burns, and DePodesta, are now at that point in time where they have to take inventory of their situation and realize, okay, what's the next step for me here? Where's the next? I'm ready to turn the page and then get to the next chapter of my career. Where exactly is that? And all these guys, they landed in different places. Neil Huntington eventually became the GM of the Pirates. Josh Burns, I think, went to Arizona first, or he might have had a pit stop on the way. He's with the Dodgers now, so I'm sure he's doing great.
Right.
And of course, as everybody knows, Paul DePodesta wound up in Oakland. But it wasn't under the circumstances that were portrayed in the film.
Correct.
Billy Beane did not fly to Cleveland and walk out of Mark Shapiro's office and notice a fat Jonah Hill sitting at his cubicle going, who is that and how do I make my entire life about him?
Yeah.
Let's have a private meeting at Gateway Garage East or somewhere close by and talk about, the goal in baseball is to buy wins, not runs. As if you need some guy who's just working in an advanced scouting position to tell you that. You don't have people in your own front office. Like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right.
That moment in the film would never happen in real life because there's no reason to fly across the country and visit the guy there. And oh, by the way, Mark Shapiro wasn't even the GM at the time.
Yeah.
John Hart was still around when DePodesta left the Indians and went to Oakland. The reason why he wound up in the A's organization was under the recommendation of Dan O'Dowd. That's it.
Yeah.
That's the story. So when you finally have an understanding of that perspective, then you can start to ask yourself the question, well, how important of a cog is DePodesta in this whole thing? Because another guy who's portrayed in Moneyball, and I know I know it's a very long-winded diatribe that I'm giving here. I'll give you a chance to speak here very shortly. But another individual who's portrayed in Moneyball rather inaccurately is Grady Fuson.
Yeah.
He was the director of scouting for the A's at the time. He was in the organization when they drafted Zito and Mulder and Hudson and Chavez. He was there when they signed Miguel Tejada, I think in 93 as an international free agent. It was either 92 or 93.
Yeah.
Somewhere along. So he has his fingerprints on the A's roster as much as anybody else. He's as responsible for the A's being in the position where they can lose a player like Giambi and still be competitive because their pitching staff is amazing.
Right.
And he is essentially painted as the villain in this film because you have to have a villain. You have to have
a dinosaur. Yeah,
exactly. But the reality of the case is him and Billy Beane never got confrontational, at least not in the manner that it was portrayed. And Billy never fired him. Grady Fuson eventually left the organization. And oh, by the way, where did he wind up? Coincidentally, in Arlington with John Hart before John Hart retired, because John Hart knew guys who knew baseball. So Paul DePodesta goes to the A's and he inherits kind of a sleeper of a situation. If you handle this thing the right way, this team could actually win a lot of games. The Mariners are not that much different on paper when you think about it. They trade Ken Griffey Jr. for a package centered around Mike Cameron. they go on to win 100 games in 2001. Now, again, they don't make that deep playoff run, but they win a lot of regular season ball games.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
I mean, and that was it was really kind of stunning because they made a run. I think at the all-time. I think they came up short on the all-time American League win record in 2001, but they were at least very close. So it was like 110 plus that they ended up having. So yes, that was kind of shocking.
Seattle wound up with 116 wins that year. And I can't remember what the AL record is.
Oh, then they broke the record. They did break the record, and that's where, again, not even making it to the World Series, thanks to the Yankees. Two follow-up things here on what you were saying. Two things I made mental notes on. One, the one thing I think, in fairness to John Hart, as far as the attempt to get the pitching in there were some things they did along the way where, again, subsequently, I mean, you'll look at would the Dolan ownership have ever done any of these things? I think not. Ken Hill in 95, I mean, that had, limited kind of effectiveness. It didn't get him over the top. Again, Jack McDowell in 96, I mean, had he held up, you never know. I mean, they made an effort, and he's the one guy that had been a legit ace that was basically a guy that they really could have, put their stock on 100%, but that didn't end up working out with him. I think he broke down. And then similarly, 97 with John Smiley. And not that John Smiley is anybody you'd consider to be an ace, but as close as they were in 97, I still say probably my all-time biggest sports heartache, narrowly ahead of the 2009 Stanley Cup final with the Red Wings. But those two are neck and neck. But, I just... they made an effort a couple of years there and came up short on that one. And then also, too, when you brought up about Sean Casey, having had him on the show once, I brought up to him how irate I was. That deal in 98, I was just MFing that deal. And he was like, well, that's great. I'm very flattered that you did. And I said, well, in all fairness, I said, you hit 380 at Akron the year before. I know there was a logjam at first base. I just thought Dave Burba wasn't nearly enough of a return for a guy that hit 380 at Akron. I said, I'm not going to blow smoke up your tailpipe here. I'm not saying we shouldn't have moved you, but we should have gotten more than Dave Burba. And I think it kind of played out to be true on that one there. But yeah, I mean, what a fascinating era it was with those Cleveland teams of that point in time. I mean, I don't think I'll ever experience anything in my life like a fan. I mean, even if this team ever makes it over the top subsequently, that was just such a magic golden era, a time and a place that'll never be replicated. And as you said, DePodesta comes out of that. And then I don't know if we're ready to get to this part or not, but full circle, he ends up coming back to Cleveland roughly 20 years after that golden era started, and ends up coming back in a football capacity with Jimmy Haslam. This is after the whole thing had happened. So in baseball, you trace it to, I think 2014 was the start of when the StatCast stuff started. And that's when, everything with the analytics truly, I mean, it was more or less, I think, universal before that. But once StatCast came out, and I remember it was able to quantify things like pitchers that had this, what people thought previously was like witchcraft. It was like, how do pitchers induce soft contact? The answer, as StatCast proved, it's the spin rate on the ball. It's if you achieve the right spin on the ball, you can induce the soft contact. And all these things started happening. We started talking about barrels and all these things, all these terms that had not been out there previously. So inevitably it starts to spill over into other sports. And Jimmy Haslam, grasping at straws after the hideous failure of the first several years of his ownership of the Browns, thinking that the next several years won't be nearly as bad, when in fact they would be worse in a lot of ways, especially record-wise, the historical futility of 0-17 or 0-16 versus 1-15. DePodesta becomes part of this front office, and post I guess it was Ray Farmer, post Mike Pettin, it becomes a matter of we're going to retool around analytics, and we're going to do in football what was done in baseball with Moneyball. DePodesta is one of the architects of this thing. And I will say, one of the original FDH Lounge dignitaries on this show, Chris Galloway, who had been for a good part of this time a proponent of that. He would talk about to me, I was pretty skeptical throughout, but he would talk to me about DePodesta is here for the engineering. It's the system. He's here to put systems in place, scientific systems. He's not here to get involved in the X's and O's with the players. He's not going to bring out his slide rule to be able to judge who's a better defensive tackle, this guy or this guy, but to put up systems and just modes of management for an organization in place that are based on reason and science. And these are words that don't fit nicely with a Jimmy Haslam organization, as we have since found out painfully over the years here. But DePodesta coming in here was one of those things where I don't think anybody could have ever seen that coming, because you don't often see guys leaping from one sport to the other in any kind of a prominent capacity. I mean, I know that a couple of years ago, I think didn't Bob Myers, I think, didn't he get involved in the Washington Commanders coaching search? I think, like, he was brought in as a consultant to be part of that, I think, by Josh Harris. And I think Magic Johnson owns teams in different sports, but that's ownership. That's having a piece of the pie versus the nitty gritty of the front office. So the guy that you're talking about here, that you think is, one of the more overrated characters out of Moneyball, that I would have to agree with you subsequently when looking at his record and what he's been responsible for. This guy subsequently jumping into the realm of football in such a prominent way is something that I don't think anybody could have seen coming. And again, it's a very interesting postscript to the movie, the book, and everything, to have this guy come in and to have it be such an amazing historical flop. So, something that basically, I think, set back the whole concept of analytics in football. I mean, progress is inevitable as these things happen. And like I said, by the 2020s, AI would have forced some of this upon us. AI is infiltrating all aspects of society. But it felt like for at least a year or two there, DePodesta was doing his best, inadvertently, I'll say, to discredit the whole notion of analytics in football, just based on how poorly it was being implemented in Cleveland in the late 2010s.
Well, before we get into the Browns debacle real quick, just a couple of railroad spikes I want to hammer into the ground.
Okay.
With the 90s Indians. The Sean Casey trade wasn't the only one at the time that, when you look back on it, was certainly not a win for the Indians and for the John Hart front office at the time. They sent Giles to the Pirates for Ricardo Rincon.
Yeah.
Not a smart move.
No.
They sent Richie Sexton to the Brewers for a package of replacement level pitching centered around Chris Woodward. Again, these are moves that make your organization worse long term. And to me, the thing about the Indians is that while it was a fun ride, that ride should have lasted a lot longer when you look back on it, because it wasn't until 1994 that team was actually a legitimate division contender, could make a run of the World Series. And by right around, I would say 2001, which was the last division title that group won together, it was over. Yeah. That 7-year window should have been a lot longer. Yeah. And it's because in the second half of that build, which started in the early 90s with some of those trades I talked about earlier on, there was I think just a lack of an appreciation for what the true prominent figures. Dan O'Dowd calls them aircraft carriers, right? So the guys like Kenny Lofton, Manny Ramirez, Jim Thome, Omar, even though not offensively, still an anchor at shortstop. What those guys would go on to achieve even after the 1997 World Series collapse. That team scored 1,000 runs in 1999. They signed Roberto Alomar in free agency. He was better than Carlos Baerga ever was, because he's one of the best second basemen ever. And that version of that team doesn't get talked about because, well, they didn't win 100 games like they did in 1995. And they had a couple of World Series losses. And so at the time, there might have been people who had some Indians fatigue. And of course, when you lose Albert Bell in free agency and you start to kind of see the writing on the wall, like the realities of baseball are going to slam you in the face. Yeah, it can be a difficult thing to look back on fondly. But the way I've always looked at it is this, and this might be an oversimplified way of looking at it, but in the case of Albert Bell, like, I know that he hit 50 home runs and 50 doubles in 1995. I also know that everybody in the clubhouse fucking hates him. Yeah. And I also know that he's only signed through 1996, and him and his agent have given us no indicator that they're interested in re-signing. So I don't feel very interested in rostering you. So I think I'm going to go ahead and trade you to, say, the Los Angeles Dodgers, because they have Todd Hollandsworth in left field, and you would be an upgrade over them. And well, they have guys like Paul LaDuca and Paul Konerko in their minor league system. I might be able to build a package around that. And then that makes you better long-term. He did that with Lofton. He got Justice and he got Grissom back, and then Kenny re-signed in 1998. But if you're not going to re-sign a guy, don't trade the younger controllable assets who are blocked from getting to the big leagues because you have guys like Manny Ramirez. If you don't think Manny's going to come back after 2000, as hard as it is, the right thing to do, the healthiest thing to do for the organization long-term is to move on from that player.
Yes.
Trading Richie Sexton for replacement level pitching because you have Jim Thome at first base for the next 3 seasons, whatever it is, it's just not smart baseball. What Brian Giles became with the Pirates and especially with the Padres, becoming a legitimate 40, 50 home run guy, those trades to me, I think they all in their own way kind of dismantled what the 1990s, early 2000 Indians could have been as quickly as the great trades kind of built that up. And to me, there was just there for some reason, and I'll never be able to understand it, whoever was involved in those decisions at the time, there just wasn't an appreciation for what that group had built. And they also had a really good farm system in 0102. They had Victor Martinez already. They had guys that were going to come up and be contributors for that club. And yeah, they couldn't make the timeline work. And I think that's the most important thing in baseball when you're playing a game that doesn't have a salary cap. You really have to be cognizant of the timeline of everything and make sure that it all works.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's unfortunate. And that'd be great if you can get Sean Casey back on here so we can maybe talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I'd love to. By a quick point about first base, and what's interesting, you talk about the timelines is, so the Sexton trade, this happens, I think, mere months before it becomes clear, because I think it was the off season of 2000 and 2001, was it not, when it was announced that the Jacobs family was selling to the Dolans. So they're thinking on the timeline here, well, when Jim Thome's up, we're just going to re-sign him because it's what we do. We spend money here. We're willing to keep our guys here. So it's interesting because that was based on a fallacy. It was the notion that, yeah, Thome's up in a couple of years, but hey, we're going to go ahead and do this here. And then, of course, I will always say, too, I mean, the thing that I just really marveled at was how it really never stuck to the Dolan family, the way that they kind of like shoved Thome out the door. I think that's why he got the statue when he came back in 2011, that he basically kept his mouth shut on that one, because the story that I had always heard was that he accepted the offer, then they pulled it off the table, and because they really didn't want him back because they weren't interested in spending that kind of money on him here. So the Sexton thing there, I never thought of it really in that sense before you brought it up as far as one of the pieces of the whole thing falling apart. But yeah, I mean, the Jacobs family allowed that trade to go through. Not that they were necessarily intricately involved, but ownership always has to, give thumbs up or thumbs down before anything happens, because, hey, Jim Thome's going to be here forever. But a year from now, new owners are going to be in place and Jim Thome won't be here forever. Just an interesting thing based on what you said.
Yeah. Well, even long-term, because when you look back at Jim and his situation, after 2000, he had an amazing run in 01-02. Because he had 49 home runs in 01, and then he chased that with a 52 home run season. That was the absolute pinnacle of his career. He was never better than that. So obviously losing him at the time stung, but at the same time, given his age, given his body type, there's always the possibility that he could run into what he eventually did run into, which was back issues, right? So you could sign him to a 6-year contract if you wanted to, but what's he going to be halfway through that? And he had a season in Philadelphia where he was just super injured. And eventually they had to move him out of the organization because he was blocking Ryan Howard. So they traded him to the White Sox where he can DH and play alongside Paul Konerko in a team context that fits for him. So in other words, what the Phillies did, they did it. I mean, I'm not saying that you go out and necessarily trade Jim Thome, because I think the Thome thing is interesting, because that's one of those cases where you do have a strong indicator that the player wants to stick around. So then it becomes your choice, and it's really your incompetency and your lack of foresight and wherewithal. If to not re-sign the player, then at least not trade him for a controllable asset or two. But, we can sit here in armchair GM or armchair baseball ops, those Indians teams. And listen, going back to my point earlier, there's a lot of fan bases that look at that point in time that will ask themselves the questions like, what if my team had zigged instead of zagged, right? Like the Orioles and like the Mariners and so on. But we're not here to talk about the past. It's time to talk about the present.
Okay.
It's time to talk about how Paul DePodesta fits into that present. because what you mentioned a few minutes ago,
Mm-hmm.
Paul DePodesta came into the Browns organization 10 years ago, post Ray Farmer, post high school Mike, and post the Johnny Manziel debacle. And when you think about it, it actually makes sense why they hired Paul DePodesta, even though it's incredibly unconventional to bring in a guy with a quote unquote baseball background. But if it were me and I were part of those conversations, I don't necessarily care where DePodesta came from, so to speak. I just want to know what his unique skill set is and how it can be translated to the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why I speak so highly of Dan O'Dowd, and I always make sure to mention him whenever DePodesta comes up, is that when he was the Indians assistant general manager and he was in charge of all these guys and he was in charge of the Indians minor league player development, he had a very basic schematic when it came to identifying players to bring into your organization and giving them a development timeline that makes sense. And that schematic is physical, fundamental, mental.
Okay.
Very simple. It's so stupid. It's so elementary that anybody can follow it.
Yeah.
And when you hear him talk about it, so if in a baseball context, right? So what is physicality? Okay. How hard can you hit the ball? How fast can you run? How big, how strong, athletic you are, whatever. Fundamental, right? Base running, field and ground balls, glove to hand transfer, that sort of thing. Knowing how to work the count. And then, of course, mental, which can be, in most cases, the toughest cookie to crack. How does this person deal with adversity? Are they coachable? Are there things going on in that person's life that might be impeding their progress, so to speak? Is it something as simple as just they're not getting enough sleep and they're tired and they're depressed all the time? Do they have a shitty diet? All these sort of things. So the reason why I find that to be so fascinating is because that I think Paul DePodesta in a vacuum could work for a professional, any sport, quite frankly. But it hasn't worked in Cleveland because he has not been able to take that schematic of physical, fundamental, mental. And really with football, because it's such an emotional game, I feel like we can expand that definition of mental to include the emotional component. So really we can call it psychological, if anything. So physical, fundamental, psychological. So we can just take an eraser and just wipe that off real quick. I think the question that you got to ask yourself, because I looked up DePodesta's record a while ago, I think like shortly after we initially were texting back and forth, because I'm like, how bad have the Browns been? Like, I know they suck, but his record since joining the organization in 2015, is 57, 106, and 1 tie.
Yeah.
That's horrendously bad. That's worse if you're trying to be bad. Teams that tank don't have that bad of a record over that long a period of time. So how is it possible, right? Well, first off, if you take a look, and this is a very bullet point version of what's going on with the Browns, there's a lot of layers to this, right? But it started out as, okay, the Johnny Manziel thing didn't work out.
Right.
No kidding, right? The way I see, like the way that I would do it, and it's going to sound so silly, but you might get a kick out of this. If I was in a front office and I was involved in that scouting, player development infrastructure, how would I grade players? How would I illustrate it in a way that made sense, both for the analytics people who know numbers, but not necessarily the humans, and then the quote unquote, baseball guys, or in this case, football guys who know the sport and they know it when they see it, right? They can ace the eye test, but maybe they're not necessarily, they don't have this as part of their lexicon. How do I bridge the two? So what I would do is I would take those three components and I would basically award gems. Like you would get like a red gem if you got the physical tools. You would get a green gem if you were fundamentally sound. You would get a blue gem if you got it in here and you got it in here.
Okay.
Basically, Johnny Manziel had none of those things. Johnny Manziel was not physically gifted. He was about 5'10", maybe about 205. He was not fundamentally sound at all. He played a very, let's just say, backyard football style at Texas A&M, and kudos to him. It won him a Heisman. It made him a lot of money because every time that he did it, it was something more to put on tape so that he could eventually sell products and be put in commercials, or at the very least trend on social media. And all these things can be money makers for him later on. And of course, he was not of sound mind and heart. Right. There's obviously, and I'm not here to kick a guy while he's down. But obviously, we know about some of the off the field issues that he had.
Sure.
So
nose candy and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, I mean, and listen, I'm not here to judge anybody's life,
Yeah.
But when you're the starting quarterback of an NFL franchise, the expectations are a little bit different. So coming out of that, Go ahead.
I was just going to say a quick side note on what you were saying about on the not fundamentally sound. I remember somebody at the time, I remember some prominent football pundit pointing this out, that one of the most famous plays he made at Alabama, where I got, maybe it was against Alabama. It was when he was at A&M, obviously. I'm thinking it might have been the Alabama game, where he pulls it down and runs for the touchdown. This pundit pointed it out. He missed every read on the play. At one point in time or another, when he was in the pocket, every one of his, I think he had 5 guys out there. Every one of them was open at one point in time or another. He missed all 5 reads, pulled it down. Yes, ran for the touchdown. But again, even in the SEC, against SEC, caliber talent, which is as close as you're going to get to the NFL by and large, with the exception of some Big Ten teams, it's still not the NFL. So you're not going to be able to do that in the NFL on a regular basis. So
yeah,
it's that's just a side note on what you said, because the minute you were talking about Manziel and the fundamentals, I wanted to get that in there.
Well, going through your progression doesn't win Heisman trophies.
No, it doesn't. No,
I think that's the whole point of it. So that's but you have to be able to look at a guy like that and go, okay, that's not a winning player.
Right.
This is something that Bill Simmons and Ryan Russillo talk about all the time when they talk hoops. It's like, okay, who's a winning player? Like that's a very basic concept that you can apply to any sport. Right. So, but it makes sense coming out of that after the Manziel debacle and how it just completely blew up in their face, that, okay, in an effort to achieve some semblance of stability, you might go off the beaten path and bring in a guy like DePodesta. And what's interesting about that is that, like, going back this past September, when I was working a seasonal job, doing one of my last senior projects, I felt awful because I really just wanted to make my Sundays like all about football, because I just, just so much chaos and turbulence going on. Like, I just wanted to have like a nice, relaxing NFL Sunday where I just watched the Browns. And I knew about 4 weeks in, when they were 1-3, that their season was over, because they weren't doing anything. And I don't pretend to be an expert on football. I'm not nearly as much as I am baseball. Baseball is my lane. I stick to it. But when it comes to football, I know a team that doesn't block when I see one. I know a team that doesn't cover when I see one. I know a team that doesn't tackle when I see one. I know a team that doesn't run good routes or get off their blocks when I see one.
Or stop the run.
Yeah. Or pretty much do anything.
Yeah.
And there was no aspect of the Browns, even on special teams, that they would consistently do well week to week that made you go, okay, that's the identity of this football team, and they're going to win a lot of games. I knew 4 weeks into the season that this team was going to challenge for the first overall pick, and they came exceedingly close to that. But going back to the whole DePodesta thing, the reason why his tenure with the Browns is so fascinating is because once you understand where he came from, and once you understand that he worked for a man named Dan O'Dowd who had a very basic schematic, you have to ask yourself, how is it possible that in 10 years, this individual, with all that he's known for, has not been able to take that very basic thing and apply it to a winning context with the Cleveland Browns? Because when I was taking inventory of why the Browns were so bad, and just I couldn't wrap my head around it, because at the time everybody was blaming Deshaun Watson, because it's like, well, the quarterback is bad, so of course the team sucks. Well, that makes sense if you're a Browns fan and you only watch the Browns, and over the last 30 years you've been watching a bad football team be bad, and that's where your center of subjectivity is. I understand that, but I do watch other teams play. Some teams win in spite of their quarterback play. Some teams don't win even if their guy's amazing. The point in all this is that you have to bring players into your organization who go through that physical, fundamental, and psychological process in a way that winning players do. And it's just a thing that hasn't happened with the Browns over the past 10 years. One of the things that I, and this is another quick sidebar, is I was thinking to myself, like, how can you have a team like the Miami Heat, for example, right? Like, if you want to compare it to basketball, they have this thing called Heat culture, which isn't working anymore because the organization became too self-aware of what it is. So it just doesn't resonate anymore. But at the time when Pat Riley was actually coaching the team, and they had guys like Dwayne Wade, and they had guys like Shaq and Udonis Haslem, and all these other just really good role players that fit what they were doing. What Heat culture really is, it's just a commitment to cardiovascular health. That way, in the fourth quarter, in a high stakes environment, in a high emotion environment, you're not as tired as the other team. It makes sense. That's taking an analytical approach to giving yourself a competitive edge, doing something a little bit different than any other organization is, and attaching a win value to it. That's all you're doing. That's all analytics does not refer to the actual mathematics the actual data that you're accumulating, because that
Right.
data can be completely arbitrary. It's
Sure.
how you apply that data.
Yeah. What do you do with it?
Exactly, which is all it, and again, that's not to say that other organizations even in the NFL don't have an analytics department. They certainly do, but the Seattle Seahawks, and that's the thing too, the Browns are not ahead of the curve on any of this. They're not. If anything, they're behind everybody else. They have the worst culture in football. That's leaving some meat on the bone. We can talk about that another day. But I've always considered myself a fan of the way the Seahawks have ran ever since Pete Carroll joined that organization, because they had a commitment from day one to really get down to the nitty-gritty of why players play football professionally when there's other things that they can do to make money, or if not make as much money, something that's not as hard on their body or on their mind or on their heart, something that's a little bit more stable, maybe a little bit higher focus, but less chaotic. And then what sort of things are going on in their life that might be an impediment on them to become the best player that they could possibly be, right? And so they have individuals in their front office whose commitment is, let's figure out what we call in sports, what a person's why is. What's your why? And the Seahawks, when they were in their Legion of Boom days, that's what they did. They figured out what makes a player want to be the best football player they can possibly be. It's a very basic concept, and everybody's going to do it a different way. But the point in all this is that in 10 years, Cleveland Browns have not found a way to do that. It started out with them tanking, which wonderful, because you need a baseball guy with an analytic background to tell you that if you lose more games, you get a higher draft pick.
Right.
Brilliant, right? I couldn't have thought of that. So they tank, and by the time they tank, John Dorsey becomes the GM, and from everything I've been led to believe, most of the picks that he made have his fingerprints, all of them. There wasn't really that Haslam interference there, so he drafts Baker Mayfield first overall in 2018. And in that same draft, he grabs Denzel Ward and he grabs Nick Chubb. Like, he grabs good football players, and he clearly has a vision for what he wants to do. Now, granted, in fairness, Mayfield was never going to be a good enough player to make up for all the shortcomings that the Browns has as an organization. And that's still true even to this day. Right. And that it doesn't mean that we can't look at him and look at what he's done in the second half of his career, seeking refuge in the NFC South and sort of reinventing himself as a Buccaneer. That's great. Good for him. But both of these things can be true. But the thing is, if you're the Browns, you don't necessarily get bonus points for being self-aware of your own futility now, do you? You have to find a way to figure out why you can't make that situation work and then address it. And in the case of Paul DePodesta, it seems to me that, whether you move on from John Dorsey to Andrew Berry to eventually who the next individual is going to be, the Browns have not figured out how to bring players into their organization who go through their physical, mental, and psychological process the way that winning players do. Andrew Berry, for example, because he's got to wear some of this as well, right? He drafted Jedrick Wills in the first round. I think it was 10th overall with his first round pick, and would go on to be the only one for several years as they gave up most of them in the Watson trade. And what has Jedrick Wills been for the Browns? He's been injured. He's been a guy who I think personifies he personifies the will to lose, I think. He's when the tough get going, quit, as Rome would say. I think he personifies that, and it's a damn shame. It's a damn shame when you're playing Joe Thomas's position. That's the type of individual. And again, it's easy for us to say, okay, what did you see in him that you didn't see in Tristan Wirfs? But at the same time, do you really need to overthink it? Iowa 3D Prince NFL lineman and Alabama linemen have been getting overdrafted for 20 years because Alabama recruits two types of football players. The aircraft carriers, to use the Dan O'Dowd euphemism, who are responsible for most of their production on the field, and then the big guys who don't have to do a whole lot, and they know that they're going to win a lot of football games because they're playing Alabama.
Right.
That's basically it. Now, again, the Browns wouldn't be competing for an AFC North title if they had Wirfs instead of Wills. It's much bigger than that, but that's just it as an example. Sure. But of course, if you want to address the giant pink elephant in the room, obviously you have to analyze the Watson trade. Yeah. And you have to look at that and ask yourself, okay, how does something like that even happen? Because I've heard two theories of this, and I'm not even sure what to believe. I lean towards one or the other. One theory is that Andrew Berry brokered the trade himself. having conversation with, I mean, I assume the Texans GM at the time was Nick Caserio. I think, I mean, it's only a few years ago.
Yeah.
That they were the ones having that back and forth. And that when Watson, because you got to remember, at that point in time, it was down to 4 teams, right? It was the Browns, and then there was the 3 NFC Souths, right? Atlanta, Carolina, New Orleans.
Right.
Well, the first team that he ruled out was the Browns because, number one, why go to the AFC when it's a tougher division, especially at the quarterback position? And who wants to play in Cleveland in November and beyond? I mean, have you seen what winter kit's like up here? So it makes sense until the $230 million contract is put on the table. Then the conversation changes. And I can understand through that number how people would speculate that Andrew Berry had nothing to do with it. It was Haslam. And it could have been Jimmy Haslam talking with ownership, Texans ownership, to make that trade happen. I don't know if it was Andrew Berry's idea and he was ready to extract himself from that situation. Then Haslam forced his hand. I don't know if that's just what Jimmy wanted. I don't know if those two and Paul DePodesta sat down, had a conference together, and looked at this as a unique opportunity for them to bring a player into their organization, and that when the time came, they were all on the same page. I honestly don't know. And I don't think any of us will ever quite know what the real story is because the Browns are so secretive about the way that they operate. But the point of all this is that it doesn't really matter how it happened because it still doesn't explain how you can have a guy like DePodesta operate in your organization for 10 years and not identify that this individual player, again, talking about Deshaun Watson here, is not a player who is physically, mentally, or psychologically fit to be a franchise quarterback, especially one that has a lot of shortcomings, as many shortcomings as the Cleveland Browns do.
Right.
He never demonstrated. People talk about this Loch Ness monster of Deshaun Watson. 2020 Deshaun Watson, when is he going to show up? He never went anywhere. 2020 Deshaun Watson was not a winning football player. He was never a top NFL QB. He was a top fantasy QB. He threw for a bunch of yards and ran for a bunch of touchdowns. That was a 4-12 football team that he was the quarterback of. Oh, well, Jay, the Browns suck, or the Texans suck. What are the Browns? What is suck if not the Cleveland Browns? How is this guy just the temerity to even think that, well, okay, the Texans can't make this work with the guy who won this national title at Clemson, but the Browns can make that work. That doesn't make any sense. So regardless of who was responsible or whose idea it was, at the end of the day, whether it was Andrew Berry's idea or DePodesta or Haslam wanted it, how is it possible that with an organization that has had DePodesta operating in that space for 10 years, how does nobody in that front office go up to Jimmy Haslam and go, hey, shithead, maybe don't trade for this fucking guy because this is not gold, this is pyrite.
Yeah.
So either nobody's doing that, in which case, what skill set and experience is DePodesta bringing to the table that even translates to the Browns or to football as a whole? Or he is, and Jimmy Haslam just isn't listening, which of course begs the question, why are you paying a guy? Why are you employing a guy if you're not going to listen to him in the first place?
Yeah.
So because the answer to neither of those questions make any sense, that leads me to believe that it probably, in all likelihood, was mostly Paul DePodesta's idea to go out and acquire this player, because at some point, him and anybody else working for him looked at that situation, attached a win value to the player, didn't factor in anything else, didn't factor in the fact that he's feuding with his current employer and willingly sitting out games because he's holding out. All of the off-the-field allegations that he has his name attached to, which I'm not here to make any declarations of what he did or did not do, but what we can say is that this is an individual who is engaging in a repeated pattern of potentially catastrophic behavior.
Yeah.
That is self-inflicted. Nobody's making...
And I'll get into that in a minute here.
Yeah. No, of course, he's an adult. You know,
Yeah.
nobody's forcing him into the situation. It's on his own accord. He's not considering the consequences of not just himself, but that of his immediate family and his closest friends and everybody on his team and everybody, all the other stakeholders. That's not what an NFL quarterback does. That's not what a franchise quarterback does. And that's not what a winning player does. But those things clearly did not matter to the Browns. So you have to begin to ask yourself exactly what Paul DePodesta's role is with the front office and why he's even employed by the Browns in the first place. And I'll even make the declaration right now, because I don't think that team is really all that interested in winning. Because I think the central focus internally is just getting the financing and getting their T's crossed and their I's dotted for the new stadium in Brook Park. And then once they get a shovel in their ground, they'll feel the weight kind of come off their shoulders. That's their internal focus right now. I don't think they give a damn about winning football games. I think it's more about putting a team in that facility that's going to play well. But I also don't think that organization is going to achieve its ultimate goals until Paul DePodesta is extracted from the situation. And that's probably also true in the case of Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski as well. These individuals are in all likelihood not going to be around for the good times. But I'm just confused as to why it hasn't happened sooner with DePodesta. I really am. So if you have any insight, I would love to hear it.
I think, again, in part because of Moneyball and the mythology of this, which is what ties together our entire discussion, I think a lot of that it's interesting, as much as DePodesta wanted to distance himself from the movie, who has, as we said, not good for my future career prospects to be seen as being played by a fat Jonah Hill playing a nerdy character. The mythology of Moneyball, which, as we're talking about, is really what it is in Paul DePodesta's case, has stuck to him. He has been able to gravy train off of that. And that's the thing where, again, it just, with Barry and with Stefanski being in there, it was thought that, because each of them is supposed to be, analytically strong, analytically inclined as far as being an executive and a coach, respectively here. And when they made that deal, this was a thing where I first and foremost revolted about the deal. For the second time in my life, I've been a Browns fan in exile. First time was in '93 when Belichick was designing bootlegs for Bernie Kosar and cut him when he wasn't able to sabotage him fully. So as soon as I was like, okay, there's an agenda here that's bigger than the team, I went into exile, and so I remained the rest of the time the Browns were here. And I have been ever since they acquired Watson. Haven't cared about it. Haven't rooted against them per se, except when they're playing the Dolphins, my 1A team, who I'm now fully invested in, because it's a thing where I got to be good friends in the year or two prior with a great young author named Maya Master, who I have dubbed the $1 trillion baby, who I think is just going to be really, really huge in the health and wellness space. And from her, I had learned something that I guess is a pretty commonly known statistic, which is in any instances of any type of sexual assault, misconduct, whatever, that the guilt rate, essentially, however you want to put it on that, is like 90% or so. So I'm looking at it like 90% times 26 cases. Like, for as much as everybody is saying, well, we don't know about all of these things here, in that field where there's smoke, there's fire, generally speaking. And I'm the last kind of person by far who's going to stand up and call myself a radical feminist, albeit I do believe in fairness here. And I'm like, these women, many of these women were victimized. I could see that. So it's like, I didn't want to be a part of that. And then it's another thing too, when you talk about this, and this is what analytics people don't take into account, the fan base. There's a lot of people that are Browns fans, I would say predominantly women, but perhaps not all of them, who themselves have been sexually assaulted, who, and I've heard them speak of this, that like their trauma comes back up by seeing this in the headlines, and that they're seeing a guy who is credibly accused of all of these things, who is the Browns quarterback and is being paid $230 million in guaranteed money. And they're saying to themselves, this is how society, views people who do this kind of thing. So analytics takes none of this into account, which is why you can't be a slave to any one tool, whether it be analytics, whether it be just, the eye test of scouting. Success comes from blending all of these things together. And I'm signing up for your bill of indictment on Paul DePodesta, because I don't think he does that. I don't think he takes the broad view of all these different things here. So I could very well be persuaded to believe that he was behind the Watson thing in the first place, because it's a thing where at the end of the day, and if this is the case, this will completely discredit his entire reputation vis-a-vis analytics, or it should discredit it if true, because it's the ultimate thing where, and I remember arguing with my friends at the time who were behind the trail. Like, I had so many friends that had rose-colored glasses. They were just like, shut up, Rick. We're getting a great quarterback who could take us over the top and take us to the Super Bowl. And it's just the simple thing of like, shortcuts don't work. They don't work. You lose all your credibility when you start talking about shortcuts. All we have to do is bring in this guy. All we have to do is overlook all of this dirt and the way that he's going to alienate a good part of our fan base and spend huge amounts of cap space on him. I remember saying at the time, I did a segment on the show with the aforementioned Chris Galloway when we debated this, and everything I said has held up very well in retrospect, I must say. And I said, because the funny thing is, I was a huge Watson guy in 2017 when he was coming out of Clemson before this was known. I feel like I was the only guy in town that wanted him in 2017. I started hearing all this crap from people about hand size. I swear to God, I never heard of anybody talking about hand size before the Watson draft of 2017. I was a fanatical Watson supporter in 2017. Couldn't have been more the opposite 5 years later. And so it's a thing where in looking at this, and looking at the whole thing of like, oh, if we can just get that guy, it doesn't work out that way. And I remember saying at the time that for as much as he had done on the field, and I will say this, I mean, you make a good point that he'd been on a bad Texans team or two. He'd also been on a Texans team or two that wasn't so great that somehow made it to the playoffs, albeit out of an armpit of a division. I'll give you that. But the guy had at least been to the playoffs and then lost in the playoffs. So I remember saying at the time, I don't hate this nearly as much on a football level as I do on, a human level. I said, but on a football level, if I was still the big Deshaun Watson fanboy I was a couple of years ago, I don't think I could justify 3 number ones. I don't think I could justify this amount of cap space. I don't think I could justify any of these things as far as the price you paid. So it's one of these things where, again, there's nothing that is less congruent with the notion of analytics in the ideal Moneyball sense, or however you would want to apply it, than getting into a situation where you're just wishing everything away and you're trying for the quick, easy fix. And you're just trying to do that. Deshaun Watson was all about the quick, easy fix. And if you're right, which I suspect you may be, that DePodesta was one of, if not the authors of the whole fiasco, then it completely discredits his place in history, because there is nothing that is less nothing less aligned with analytics in a way that they're supposed to be applied alongside scouting and everything else than the quick fix, the easy fix. And that's all Deshaun Watson ever was.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the case of the quick fix, in some cases you do get exceedingly lucky.
Yeah.
Like the Saints did with Drew Brees. And I'm sure Dolphins fans are still kicking themselves about that all these years.
Yeah.
It's understandably so.
Yeah.
They took a chance at him. A lot of people thought with the shoulder injury that he couldn't play anymore. But Drew Brees wasn't just successful in one of the most prolific passers in NFL history based on skill alone. No, he's one of the most physically, fundamentally, and psychologically sound quarterbacks that has ever played the game in my lifetime. That's why he was able to play at such a high level for so long, despite the injury and despite everything else. That's a case where it works because the human being is right. Mm-hmm. And it is surreal to hear you say, but it's true. There was a time, believe it or not, where Deshaun Watson was a babyface in the eyes of many people. Coming out of Clemson, he had that national title shine to him. A lot of people were kind of warming up to Dabo Swinney at the time, although I think most people have kind of turned since then. Sure. I think his act is kind of worn thin a little bit, but he was this very soft-spoken, very reserved kind of guy that you could easily root for.
He was a white meat baby face. Bob Backlund circa 78.
Yeah. But here's the thing, it can work when the sport that you play it with a certain level of charisma. And that's why Baker Mayfield, I think he had his supporters in Cleveland for so long, because he's not great, but he does play with this weird kind of style that would remind you of some of the guys from the mid 2000s. I've made the jokes too. I've used all the names, Baker Pennington, Baker Delhomme, Baker Kitna, et cetera, et cetera. He reminds you of those guys that didn't have amazing careers, but they did have a season or two where it all kind of came together for them and they punched above their weight. The guy that he's actually most like is Jeff Garcia, which coincidentally enough spent the latter part of his career in Tampa Bay and was actually pretty good. And people might think, well, that's kind of, that Jeff Garcia. Well, first of all, Jeff Garcia is a 4-time Pro Bowler. How many Pro Bowls has Baker Mayfield had to his name? That's not an insult at all. I'm talking about guys that play above their ability, right? But that's not something that Deshaun Watson has done. I don't really know at any point in his career, but he was this soft-spoken, very reserved kind of guy. You maybe thought that he might have been a little, are we talking about a guy who, has something going, it was ADD or something like that? Not to, but whatever the case may be, okay, this is a guy that you can get behind, but it also underscores why it really is important to do a deep dive and really start to peel back the layers of a human being
Right.
beyond the helmet and pads, because we really don't know these people. We
Yeah.
don't know anything about them. But what we do know is that they, like us, have things that prevent them from being the best, in this case, person, but also football player that he could be.
Yeah.
And you're right. Analytical people are probably at this stage, the pendulum has swung around, I think, to come around to the reality that the further you lean to that part of the spectrum, the more likely you are to make a decision like that and disregard the consequences, right? Which is why Andrew Barry's complicit in this as well, because he hasn't exactly demonstrated an ability to draft and develop players
No.
and turn them into. No, if anything, the Browns have underachieved. And when he came back from Philadelphia, the number one thing that he is, I would say, most adept at is salary cap manipulation. And the salary cap in the NFL is easy to manipulate. You can add it seemingly unlimited amount of void years to a guy's contract and push this fake money that you're not actually paying the player, but it counts against you in the cap, but the cap goes up like 12 million every year. So it's basically like a drop in the bucket. It's monopoly money, right? But when you think that you can do that, to me, that makes you a very dangerous individual to have in the front office, because you don't have this thing called discretion.
Yep.
You're not making decisions based on those human factors. You might not even be necessarily consciously aware of all the limiting factors that are going on in an athlete's life, right? And I don't want to paint with a broad brush and say that that's everybody who's more analytically inclined, but I do think you bring up a good point, like you did a few minutes ago with D. Podesta. I mean, I'll go one step further and say this whole thing about the relationship between team and fans, right? And this goes for all forms of entertainment, right? Another thing I talked about on the podcast, right? In audience research, the relationship between performer and audience and how it's got to be built on the right things. Yeah, I would say the Browns probably have the most unhealthy relationship with their fans and vice versa. And that's based on a lot of factors. And Paul DePodesta has no concept of that, or at the very least, he hasn't demonstrated that. And I think that's one of the things, because I have this thing, I call it my upside down Mount Rushmore of things that are holding baseball back from being appointment television and just being a sport that people care about like they did a long time ago. And it's not just because of steroids, right? Because the 90s were amazing for everything. All right. The 90s were, gas was cheaper, food tasted better, wrestling was amazing. Things were just better in the 90s. And it was a unique time for all of us. And yeah, that's probably never going to happen again, because, certain real world events dictate that that's just not, we're probably not going to find a new equilibrium that resembles that time period.
Sadly, yeah, true.
Yeah. But at the time, yeah, it was amazing. But that's not, steroids and those guys are not what's holding baseball back. If it's me, my upside down Mount Rushmore comes to four things. Number one, I think baseball players by and large have personalities that are indistinct from one another. I don't want to call them boring, but they're certainly bland. Mike Trout is supposed to be the face of baseball, but he's one of the most bland superstars there's ever been.
Yeah.
Ken Griffey Jr. is still the face of baseball 30 years after his peak as a young face of the Mariners franchise. Even now, that's the truth. He's one of the most beloved figures in the history of the game. Anybody who's followed the game over the last 50 years. So that's one of them. The other thing, too, is, of course, blackouts, right? Not meeting fans where they're at in terms of coming up with a distribution model that meets everybody's needs.
Right.
Number three is this disparity of wealth that has been allowed to just inflate into this just inconceivable reality where you have a team like the Mets with a $350-60 million payroll, and then teams like the Pirates, the Marlins, the Rays, and of course the A's, which is understandable because of the turbulence. Yeah, and that's the thing too, and it's not just the fact that it's not, because the way they illustrated in Moneyball is that there are rich teams and there are poor teams. And then there's 50 feet of crap. And then there's us.
Yeah.
The truth is, in baseball, there's an upper class. There's the top 1%. There's an upper middle class, a lower middle class, and then a lower class. And that's where you find your teams that just have no fans, like the Marlins and the A's. And right now, Cleveland is in that lower middle class.
Right.
They're in that lower middle class with the other teams in their division, the Royals and the White Sox, right? The Reds, the Pirates, because they've allowed themselves to become a part of that reality. Ownership is complicit in this as well. All of these owners have allowed this thing to go on where they're okay with this financial model where there's such a disparity from the top to the bottom because of revenue sharing and other things that kind of flatten out that disparity a little bit. But it's not good for the fans. because it doesn't paint your sport in the right picture,
Right.
in my opinion. It's almost as if you have these teams over here that are playing one sport and these teams are in another. And that's, to me, that's just not a sustainable business model when it comes to just understanding your audience's emotional needs. And then the last thing is analytics, because of what you said. I don't know that people who have a statistical background have that strong of a concept. I can only speak for myself, but baseball is my number one sport for a lot of different reasons. Just speaking as a neurodivergent individual, obviously the Indians have a lot to do with that, because I've been watching baseball since I was 2 years old, and I remember these guys. Like I remember watching this team on NBC back when they had the baseball rights. Like I could tell you, and not even just the Indian stats, but like who the teams that we played in the playoffs were, like the 95 Braves. Like I memorized I could tell you what Javi Lopez was hitting that year. There's no reason to even be able to remember that stuff, but it resonated with me. So yes, that's a part of it. There is a nostalgic component to that. But when you really break it down, baseball is played by humans, not spreadsheets. And while it is a game of structure, it's also unpredictable. And to try to break baseball down into simple numbers that might delude you into thinking that you can predict outcomes is a fool's errand. Baseball has a rhythm and a pace to it that really lets you breathe, and it lets you kind of go through the emotions of it. Other sports don't do that. The NHL, you can't do that because you're either on the bench waiting for your time to go on the ice, or when you're on the ice, you're just on the ice. Football, it's hard to do that as well, even when you're on the bench, just because you're so physically beat up from the sport. But baseball, there's a lot more downtime, and it's just it gives you that space. And in a lot of cases, I feel like to a detriment, because a lot of people get in their own heads, and it works against them. But I've always loved the fact that it's more of a mental chess match. It's not just physical chaos. Of course, like collisions happen and fights occasionally happen, which I think might actually make the sport better if it had more of a code like hockey does, where the players kind of police that side of things. And if a fight needs to happen, let it happen. Don't let it be this thing where they brawl and then both dugouts clear and then a bunch of guys come running from the bullpen to do nothing. Don't let it be a mess. Let these guys go at it, and then have the umpires break it up. If by the end of the day, when they all have microphones stuck in their face, when they're sweaty and in their underwear, they can say their piece, drop the mic, and exit stage right, and they're done with it. Right. It might be the best thing for both of you, for everybody involved. I do believe. I mean, I do agree with the idea that stats give baseball a sense of structure, and it gives you a sense of certainty or objectivity for a game that's otherwise unpredictable. But it also has a humorous side to it that I think has gotten lost. I really do. And there's a lot of layers to peel back from that. Everybody who has a baseball podcast talks about what pitching has become, where guys are coming out of high school throwing high 90s and they're blowing their elbows out at 18 years old because they watch TikToks and YouTube shorts of guys throwing just absolute filth. To circle back what you were talking about before about spin rate, right? Well, when you figure out, okay, well, how can I make your fastball move more? If you're an organization like the Tampa Bay Rays and you're one of the first ones to figure it out, one of the downsides to that is that you pay less and less attention to how much stress you're actually putting on the guy's elbow, and how all these talented young arms, and I've had them on my fantasy teams. I know all these guys like Shane McClanahan and Shane Boz and Taj Bradley and Jeffrey Springs and Drew Rasmussen. All these guys have had season-ending operations, either elbow or shoulder or otherwise, right? And that is not the baseball that I grew up with. No. And it's not the reality that we should be living in. And frankly, it's not good for the sport. And I don't know how you reverse engineer that. I really don't. Because a lot of guys are coming up through the high school ranks and into college. They just want to throw gas. All they care about is how fast it was and how much did it move. And I can understand that because, if for most guys out there, they grow up and maybe they don't have the right mentality. That's who you are as a baseball player. That's fine. I'm not here to change you to the point where you disassociate from yourself as an athlete, or you no longer connect to the game in a way that makes you not want to play it at all anymore. Right. But we cannot be graduating players through our minor league system and putting them out on the mound with the expectation they're going to throw 4 2/3 innings on their best day. Right. That's also not a sustainable business model. And that's something that has happened because we have developed these models that allow us to maximize velo and movement, but not maximize stamina and durability.
Right.
And that's,
Yeah.
I wonder, I really do wonder that if in a football context, what the Cleveland Browns have done
Mm-hmm.
to put themselves in a position where they're bringing in players. Because it seems to me, because they don't grade well on their NFLPA report card.
No.
And maybe that's not necessarily the best litmus test for how things are going in your organization, but certainly that's the best they got. And you certainly don't get that level of transparency from the entire player population in any other context, right?
Right.
If a player hates their coach, yeah, that might not be the reason that you're losing, but even teams that lose a lot of games don't blame their coach. In most cases, a team sucks. They know that they suck.
Yeah.
and they talk openly about it, and they're able to laugh about it. I genuinely have concerns. And I also believe that in most cases, they have the wrong guys in the organization. They don't bring players in that have the mentality of a professional football player. But it does make me wonder what those guys in Berea who practice every single day during the season, what they go home and think about, what they talk about, what they call each other on the phone or text each other about. Think of not just the front office, but everybody who's operating in that space. It genuinely gives me serious concern.
Oh, yeah.
Because I have not been given a real world example where I can look at somebody who, again, if you have a spectrum where, on the left side, you have like the progressive, the analytic side, and over on the right side, you have the more conservative, old school, traditional, baseball guy, football guy. I'm legitimately concerned that if the Browns are operating more on the left end of that spectrum, what their own players think of that and what their reputation throughout the league is. I would imagine most people laugh at them, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Or if they're not laughing, they just go, and I've been doing that for a very long time. And that's the other thing too. Like you said it, that relationship. I've never really looked at the Cleveland Browns as like my team the same way that I have other teams, because I just don't relate to them in that way. And I certainly don't relate to them now with their organizational philosophy and the way that they handle their business, and even everything down to their iconography, not being able to decide which logo that they want to use to represent themselves.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but yeah, it is the reality. So
it is. Yeah, it is. And I will say, and by the way, just to track back to one of your things for a second there, subsequently, I think it would probably be a good discussion here on the show as far as I have long said that I think analytics has worked very much against baseball's watchability issues, 3 true outcomes, everything like that, uppercut swing. And that I don't fault any teams for embracing analytics. And it's not the job of a front office to worry about the aesthetics of the game and everything like that. But it's one of those things where nobody's thinking about it. And that's where, again, the incentives have to change a bit. We can get into that. That sounds like a good other segment here. But as far as what you're saying about the Browns and everything like that, I would really kind of tend to agree, because I think it was late 90s when Mark Cuban was the first one to really do this, where he was ahead of the curve with Dallas of like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to spend money in all the areas that don't count against the salary cap. They were like the first team in pro sports that had like the biggest, fluffiest, softest towels in the locker room. They always flew first class, and then I think, subsequently private at a time when many teams weren't flying private. It was like you take your money and you spend it in all the areas that don't count against that. And also in Dallas, for the last 20 years or so, they've had a really, really great GM for the Dallas Stars, Jim Nill, who previously was around the turn of the century part of the front office of my beloved Detroit Red Wings, who spent lavishly on executives and at that point in time, pre-salary cap, could spend what they wanted on the players. But top to bottom, they were spending throughout in the organization to try to make it as star-studded as it could be. And there was even one or two other folks, a guy by the last name of Anderson, I remember in the front office, that was pretty strong. I think he was a big part of the European pipeline as well. I don't remember his exact name, but it was a thing where, and you still had Jimmy Devellano chipping in with his insight as an advisor, even past the time when Ken Holland took the helm. So smart teams, smart organizations want to control all of that stuff. So the whole thing of like, I hear from these mouth breathing fans like, oh, who cares what the what the players union says on their thing? And it's like, we can take issue with the accuracy or whatever of it, but the notion that you shouldn't be trying to be the best in it. You may not like how the players union does it, although I haven't seen anything that really discredits their methodology. But even if you find something that discredits their methodology, worrying about all these other things, this is how you get free agents in a way where you're not having to break the bank on everybody. This is how you get those little edges, the tangible edges in the ways that count. So if you're not worried about that, you're not a competent organization, as the Browns aren't. And again, DePodesta, he has been, I think, through the course of our discussion here today, sort of, he's sort of become the central figure and emblematic of a lot of, what analytics was supposed to be and what it has failed to be, I think, in a lot of different kinds of ways here. And again, fascinating that, again, as I said before, for a guy that's not even in the Moneyball movie, it's this fictional character, Peter Brand. So DePodesta wasn't in that, but yeah, I mean, per the way you kind of steered this thing, I think he has become one of the most fascinating figures long-term to come out of the Money book, maybe not so much the movie, but the book. And the role that he's played on the American sports landscape in the last 30 years or so here. And it's sort of, the being a part of some of the high points of analytics, which, by the way, I will say the late 90s Indians, per what you were saying before, it may not have been analytics in quite the same way that Moneyball and Bean was doing it years later, but the John Hart front office was a bit ahead of its time in some concepts. So maybe a little bit of sort of Moneyball before there was Moneyball. He was a part of that. He was part of one of the organizations that pioneered the whole concept. But the lessons he's drawn from that and where he's gone over the years since is almost sort of a tragicomedy, I would say.
And to circle, it's amazing. Your point about Mark Cuban brings us all the way back to the 90s Indians about spending in areas that don't account against the cap.
Yes.
That's exactly what that front office did. That's exactly what the John Hart, Dan O'Dowd Indians did. And you can ask Sean Casey about this, and he'll tell you. When he was in the minors, they ate like big leaguers. They traveled like big leaguers. They worked out and trained like big leaguers. And eventually they became the best big leaguers they could have become.
Yep.
That's exactly how they did it. And yes, they also had a methodology that I would agree is ahead of their time. They were attaching a win value to players that maybe gave them a little bit of an edge, or at least an opportunity to look at player evaluation through a slightly different lens. But it was all based on a very simple schematic, like over my shoulder. And it was also done through those efforts, through those monetary efforts and really human efforts to treat everybody in your organization from top to bottom. Because that's the whole point of physical, fundamental, mental. Everybody in your organization knows where they stand at all times. Everybody from the guy leading off when on opening day at Jacobs Field, or whoever's playing short season single A for the Columbus Red Sticks, or whoever else were the minor league affiliates at the time. Everybody's going to know where they stand, and everybody's going to be treated the absolute best that it could possibly be. And they reaped the rewards from it. It just didn't last as long as they did, just through a lack of, again, what I said earlier about a lack of wherewithal and foresight, and not being able to find, I think, smoother ways to transition from your organization taking on one complexion to the next. But I think that's another conversation for another day, because we can certainly talk about the Mark Shapiro years and how awkward it was, trying to build a team where Milton Bradley is your highest WAR player, and how that's not going to work. Because to me, that's another conversation about, okay, this guy is probably about a 4.5 WAR player at his peak, give or take, because he's a very good hitter, not an amazing hitter, but a very good one, can play a plus outfield, good base runner, but he's a clubhouse cancer. He's probably the clubhouse cancer in my lifetime. So attach a win value to that.
Yeah.
Attach a win value to the other 24 guys that he has to operate in the clubhouse with. If everybody else is 0.2 WAR or worse, you multiply that by 24. Yeah. The whole rest of your team is minus 4.8 WAR. That completely offsets everything that Milton Bradley is actually doing with a bat in his hands.
Yep. Negated.
Yeah. So you have to bring players into your organization that make everybody else around them better, or at least not make them actively worse. Yeah. And that's another thing that's another concept that I felt like has kind of escaped those guys in a lot of ways. The Pirates, they fired Derek Shelton a week ago, and that thing kind of took on a life of its own, where now if whatever podcast you listen to or anybody you're subscribed to on YouTube, the conversation basically, it eventually became into, well, the reason why they suck is Bob Nutting. And he's sort of been painted as like in a lot of ways the Dan Snyder of Major League Baseball, which I don't think is completely unfounded. I mean, I'm not,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is kind of funny though when you look at them in the face, like the resemblance is a little bit uncanny. But I remember Ken Rosenthal. I think it was Rosenthal anyway. He went, I think he went on Intentional Talk or somebody else's podcast, but he asked the question, like because he cited Bob Nutting, what he said about, a commitment, right, to building this thing the right way and sustain success and all that. And Rosenthal was like, "What about you? You don't spend any money." And of course, I'm sitting here listening to this. Well, the Pirates haven't had anybody that's been really, really good over the last 30 years, ever since Barry Bonds left in free agency, that you would give out that 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year, $200, $250 million contract to, because they haven't drafted well enough and they haven't developed players well enough.
Right.
And they went from, after I think it was, I want to have this right. I know that Cam Bonifay was there, and he might have been there right when Barry Bonds left. But after he left the Pirates, it was Neil Huntington, who came from the Indians front office, and he was the Pirates GM for like 14 years.
Yep.
And now it's Ben Sherrington. So they basically went from one John Hart disciple to the other.
Right.
So why would you suspect that your player development and talent acquisition would get any better over a period of time?
Yeah.
They're just not good enough. These guys, Shapiro, like, they're all painfully average.
Yeah.
If you're a fan rooting for one of those, lower middle class or even upper middle class teams, you have to be ahead of the curve. You have to be better than everybody else. I do think that history will dictate that the Indians probably got the best guy out of that group, and Chris Antonetti, to run the front office. And he's not perfect either.
Yes.
Everybody's got their shortcomings, and certainly, over the last 10 or so years, the Indians, now Guardians, have had a type when it comes to drafting, big, long, left-handed hitting, toolsy, projectable outfield prospects with a lot of swing and miss in their games, who don't develop as hitters because they can't time up their swing consistently well. And they've never been able to develop that guy. They have to get that kind of player from outside the organization. But they've also done a great job with their pitching staff. So you got to take the bad with the good. But I think it speaks to a broader truth about how Paul DePodesta, when you step back and look at it from 30,000 feet, I don't think his skill set is all that remarkable. I don't think that what he's done, certainly not as a football executive, he's been an embarrassment. But even as a baseball executive, I think it's a little bit overblown. And I genuinely do believe that, again, he is without question one of the most overrated guys that you could ever have these type of conversations about. The fact, and you said it multiple times, that there's a movie that he's technically not even in. There's a character based on him, but that's just Jonah Hill being Jonah Hill.
Right.
But everybody eventually, all you have to do is pull out your phone and Google, A's, assistant GM, Billy Bean, assistant GM or whatever, and you'll get this guy and you can read up on him.
Yep.
I just don't think that his achievements and his accomplishments in the game of baseball are really all that substantial. Certainly not enough where if you're an NFL owner and if you're trying to achieve some semblance of stability, that you would go that far off the beaten path and bring that guy into your organization. And considering what the Browns have done to embarrass themselves over the last 10 years, through the poor drafting and through the fully guaranteed contracts and the guys that they've acquired along the way. Yeah, I think these are all stains on his resume, in my opinion. And it's unfortunate because I don't like talking about people in this context, but at the same time, I don't have a personal relationship with any of these guys, so it's not like I have to worry about getting a text from somebody else who said, "Hey, I heard that you said this about this person."
Sure.
I'm just a fan. I'm a fan like anybody else, and I have a relationship to my team and an interest in the sport as a whole. And to me, what the Browns have done, I mean, obviously, aside from losing, of course, it just doesn't speak to the heart of where I would consider myself to be as a football fan, where I think you would be as a football fan, and where I think most people who live in this part of the country who follow the sport very closely and love it and sometimes hate it. I just don't think that they're tapped into that. And it's unfortunate. And I'm not exactly sure what the pivot is. You never really know with the Haslams.
No.
And their singular focus is getting that stadium built. So that all remains to be seen. And in the meantime, you're just kind of in a holding pattern where I don't want to say tanking, but you're not exactly built to win. So it's going to be a long season for them again, but at least this time I'm not going to be, riding around in a golf cart after week 4 going like, why can't I watch my team just run the ball really well and be like a nice, safe, like boring, good team?
Yeah.
The sport doesn't have to be exciting. Sports are really boring to people who don't get them. Right. Everything is boring if you don't have an interest in it, but I don't need it to be 7-on-7. I don't need to see a team. I don't need to see 52-48 every single game. I don't need to see that. I just want to watch a team play good fundamentally. And that goes for any sport, man.
I mean, and I have 2 thoughts on that as we bring this all the way around here. One is, when you're talking about, as the aesthetics of something here, I remember responding on Facebook to our FDH senior editor, Jason Jones, my great friend, some years ago, a long time ago, maybe plus or minus 15 years ago. Remember that, and I'd be interested to go back and see how this played out with the number of future Pro Bowl players that were involved. That one LSU-Alabama game, prime time in the regular season, everyone was like, this will be the greatest, clash of talent ever. And I think the final score was like 9-6. And I remember like Jason was on Facebook and like everybody was saying this is going to be the greatest game ever. This is boring. This sucks. And I remember responding to him like, bro, they weren't promising you like a 5-star wrestling match. It was like, it's not about the aesthetics of it. It's the talent on the field. And that's, and it lived up to it in that building. The other thing that I want to, bring up here is, as regards the tribe and their way of doing business here. This was a story that was recounted recently on the show. Myself and FDH Lounge dignitary Steve Callis doing a tribute to our great friend and another gentleman that you played fantasy baseball with, Ken Detweiler, and talking about him and Paul's. And I said, this is one of those things where like doctor-patient confidentiality ends at the grave. I don't think Ken would mind me telling the story now. So, as was fairly commonly known, Ken is, in-laws with the Dolans. So one time he and his late sainted wife, Tracy, are out to dinner with Paul Dolan and his wife. And the check comes and Paul Dolan goes to reach for it. But Ken grabs it and says, I got it. You put that toward a right-hand power bat. And I have always loved that story. I'm like, that's the Walter Mitty moment where we all lived through him. Who among us doesn't wish we could have said that to Paul Dolan? So, Ken did it when he had the opportunity because that's the kind of great guy that he was. And certainly this is the kind of great discussion. I had a lot of these over the years, on air with Ken, a lot of them off air as well. And so this is certainly type of thing that he would have relished. But like I said, putting a pin in it for, subsequently here, I'd like to examine some of the stuff with you about, again, what analytics has done in baseball. Like I said, to my theory about making it less watchable and some of the things like that. But, this is the kind of great long form discussion that we love getting to do on the show and don't get to do nearly as often as I would like to because of the dictates of the news cycle. In a lot of different ways, be it the sports calendar, the news calendar, etc. So truly great to be able to do this with you, Chris. I was really looking forward to bringing you in for this, and I'll look forward to anything we get to do subsequently. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I can't thank you enough. Not just because of the emotional weight of everything, with all the characters who have been involved in the fantasy baseball league over the years, but it's therapeutic for me to be able to get to do this because a lot of these thoughts are things that I've kind of been sitting on for a while and just haven't had the opportunity to share them in a space like this. And I was hoping to share them in an academic setting, and I didn't need to in the end. I mean,
sure.
I got my A, for my capstone projects. I finished that, and that's done with.
Okay.
But when you leave a lot of things on the cutting room floor, again, and this is just me, when you fancy yourself a creative person, and you just kind of have all this stuff that you're just like you can't do anything with it because you don't have a place for it to exist yet. Allowing it to exist in a place like this, it gives me a sense of fulfillment that I don't really have in a lot of other areas of my life.
Well, so I feel good hearing that because you deserve that. You're a very talented individual, and I look forward to seeing everything that's going to come subsequently. And I'm sure some of that can come here as we move along in the future. But this was great. Now your thoughts are out there in the universe. You got what you wanted, and this is going to be great. And people are going to enjoy getting to hear what you had to say, most importantly.
Yeah, hopefully. And the other thing too is that I think it might be one of those things that might fall on deaf ears at first, but I think just through osmosis, as we go into the future and certain events start to unfold, it might start to feel like it has more of a Nostradamus quality to it than anything else. Again, not saying that, that I can predict the future or anything like that. Again, all I'm saying is that just based on what I've seen, I don't have confidence in the Browns as an organization.
Right.
And when they do eventually get themselves in a position where they can look at themselves and appraise themselves as contenders, if that day ever comes, it won't be with the individuals that they have. And I think history will dictate that we'll look back on this period of time and over the last 10 years as having done more harm than good. Certainly there are lessons to be learned from it, but the Browns are a very interesting case study, I think, in what happens when you let that analytical approach kind of dictate everything that you do and start looking less and less at the actual nuances of the sport and learning and applying some of the lessons and methodology of people who came decades and decades before who didn't have access to all this data before. The 27 Yankees were not built through analytics. I mean, they were built off of this.
Yeah.
And granted, the environment was completely different. The talent pool wasn't quite as deep. So if you had the cash, you could buy that talent.
Right.
It's not quite as easy anymore. But people still had to find talented players. People still had to find them, and they didn't have StatCast. They didn't have FanGraphs or any of these other resources that we have access to do it. No, they knew it when they saw it, or they saw something, and again, people who work in player development are not miracle workers.
Mm-hmm.
The way I've always looked at it, if I was ever fortunate enough to get into that role myself and operate in that space, I would say if I'm just making somebody that much better,
mm-hmm.
I've done my job. Even if it means that you have to do all of these things just to get that much out of it. Sometimes that's a reward, and you have to be okay with that, because at the end of the day, that's really all you can do, because there's other limiting factors at play that are far, far outside of your control. So,
absolutely. Yeah, and it's smart to be able to note that as well, because not everything can be controlled, notwithstanding what some of the analytics guys will say. And whenever you talk about like the 27 Yankees, it always kind of makes me smile when I see this stuff now, like when you'll see it referred to as like the war of the older players, and I'm just picturing like some sports writer going up to Babe Ruth like, "Hey Babe, congratulations on your first 10 WAR season. How does it feel?" It just makes it just the whole notion of their heads would have exploded thinking about that kind of stuff.
Well, you talked about the 5-star match thing earlier, like that's basically the equivalent of going up to somebody after WrestleMania and sticking a microphone in their face and thinking about like, "Oh, so Dave Meltzer gave you 4 1/4. What do you think about that? Is that what what you were hoping to do?" And that's the difference in some locker rooms. Some locker rooms care very much about what Dave puts to paper, and others did not care any less. And to me, maybe it's not exactly the same thing. But war to me, like, I don't know that anybody really cares about it until contract negotiations come.
Yeah.
Which again, I think also, to me, that sets up a future conversation of like, well, do these numbers really exist? For what practical purpose do they exist other than just as a negotiating tactic? We have this advanced stat that says, well, underneath the hood, you're not that good of a player, so we're offering you this much in arbitration. Right. So your agent now has to find a way to navigate through that and get you the money that you think that you're owed based on your batting average and your home runs and all that. So, but I think we've definitely left some meat on the bone. I think we can.
We definitely have
topics in the future.
I mean, and how many people could say that? How many people could be about 12 minutes shy of 2 hours and say they left meat on the bone? But we did. We left a lot to go through subsequently, and it has kind of whet my appetite to do it again. So I really appreciate it here, Chris. Thank you so much for being part of a great discussion about the legacy of Moneyball and analytics here in the 21st century. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for checking out FDH Lounge mini episode 1832.